I'd like to welcome back a speaker that we had before, giving us a wonderful talk on the history of the San Fernando Valley, and that's Jerry Rishe. How many of you were here for that lecture? Okay, quite, you still can't hear me. Well, can you hear me now? That's all right. All right, I'm just going to introduce a brief bio of Jerry again for those of you that were not here. Jerry earned a bachelor's degree in political science from CSUN, where he was an award-winning speaker in intercollegiate forensic competition and later received a JD from Whittier Law School. He worked as in-house counsel at First Charter Financial Corporation, a holding company for American Savings, the J.G. Boswell Company, the largest privately owned cotton grower in the world, and St. John's Hospital and Health Center in Santa Monica. In the public sector, and for the last 16 years of his legal career, he was a trial attorney with the Immigration and Naturalization Service, later the Department of Homeland Security, where he prosecuted those charged with violations of Immigration and Naturalization Act in immigration court, defended his service and department against charges in employment matters, and was honored by being named Employee of the Year, an agency of over 16,000 employees whose offices are located across the country and around the world. He is now enjoying retirement as a docent at Autry Museum of the American West in Griffith Park, participating in SAGE, a lifelong learning organization for retirees, traveling, and his family. And now he's here to share us a talk on Immigration Act of 1924. Jerry, welcome back.
Thank you, and can everyone hear me? My wife tells me I speak too loudly. And thank you, too, for inviting me back. Last month was a pleasure speaking before your group, and I hope you enjoy. Enjoy is not as exactly the right word, because this is, for the most part, a sad story, but one that I think really needs to be told. So just before I begin, let me ask you, how many of you have heard of the 1924 Immigration Act? Oh, quite a few. I never get that many responses to even a hint as to what it was, what it's about. It's also known as the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act of 1924. So let's begin. Prescott Hall was an American lawyer and author who championed nativism, eugenics, and immigration restriction. And he was incensed over rumors that the League of Nations might limit the right of any nation to decide who shall be admitted. He wrote in 1919 that any such clause was a threat to the soul of the nation, in particular the United States, of course, and concluded that, here's the quotation, immigration restrictions are a species of segregation by which inferior stocks can be prevented from diluting and supplanting good stocks. Nice thought. The historical and legislative context in which the 1924 Immigration Act unfolded is vital in appreciating its origins, content, and import. Here's a very brief overview. In the second half of the 19th century, U.S. immigration shifted from northern and western to southern and eastern Europe, also some from Asia and Mexico. These migrants were part of millions around the globe who left their countries to escape stagnant economies, civil unrest, persecution, population growth, and to take advantage of demand for unskilled labor in rapidly industrializing nations. Regulating and restricting mass migration was just as global. It was not limited to the United States. In the United States, though, Americans and Northern Europeans and Western Europeans, those of those ancestries at least, viewed new immigrants as, well, they were unassimilable, in addition to being biologically and culturally inferior. Race emerged early in our nation's history as a marker of citizenship eligibility. In the 1790 Nationality Act, for example, Congress restricted naturalization, as you can see, to any, I'm sorry, where's the clicker? I haven't been, there's Prescott Hall for you. There's the, sorry I didn't do this, the immigration of the 19th century. And here we are on this slide. I got so excited to speak before you, I forgot my clicker. So as you can see, the 1790 Nationality Act, Congress restricted naturalization to any free white person, creating a legal category ineligible for citizenship. Congress passed then the Page Act in 1875 to end the danger of, and this is a quotation by the way, cheap Chinese labor and immoral Chinese women. Yes. And of course, there they are. They targeted Asian women in particular who were suspected of coming to the United States for lewd and immoral purposes. The law built on a long history of state immigration restrictions and intersected with trade treaties among the United States, the Americas, Africa, Asia, and Europe. 7 years later, Congress expanded federal immigration authority with the, I'm sure many of you have heard about this, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, and the Immigration Act, also passed that same year, 1882, which put the federal government in charge of U.S. immigration and introduced national systems of management and deportation. You see, before that, it was the states that controlled immigration. After 1882, it was the federal government. They were ineffective at first because of limited funding, limited staffing, and lack of a well-developed regulation system. Borrowing from state laws, who were the ones, as I said, who were in control of immigration before that, the Immigration Act of 1882 excluded convicts, lunatics, idiots, or any person unable to take care of themselves without becoming a public charge. Remember that last term, remember becoming a public charge, because it's not only in effect today, it was in effect later on during the Depression when another administration implemented that very law from 1882. Virulent nativism and the rising population of the eugenics movement increased scrutiny of disabled immigrants. By 1907, the Immigration Restriction League criticized current laws as barring, here's their quote, only the most obviously diseased, decrepit, feeble-minded, and generally unfit. They didn't think the law was going far enough. In 1917, Congress created an Asiatic barred zone, excluding all Asians. About the same time, the Senate passed a bill to exclude all members of the African or black race. I'd never heard of this before until I had done the research. This effort was defeated in the House only because after extensive lobbying by the NAACP, including what was called the Negro Silent Parade, 15,000 people marched in New York City. Efforts to exclude the supposedly racially undesirable Central, Southern, and Eastern Europeans were more successful. Attempting to inject eugenics into law, the 1917 Immigration Act added constitutional psychopathic inferiority. Isn't that a wonderful phrase? as an exclusionary class, including unstable individuals on the borderline between sanity and insanity, such as those with or abnormal sex instincts. They were targeting homosexuals. By World War I's end, rules for excluding immigrants with physical and mental disabilities were so vague and so broad, nearly any immigrant could be excluded. Meanwhile, migrants from Mexico offset lost Asian and European workers urgently needed in factories, mines, and agriculture. In 1929, Congress would pass the Undesirable Aliens Act to control and criminalize even Mexican migration. The act made unlawful entry a misdemeanor and re-entering the United States after deportation a felony. The Immigration Act of 1924, also known, as I mentioned before, the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, was signed into law only 2 months after Virginia's Eugenical Sterilization Act, and severely limited immigrants' numbers by creating country quotas. It also ended an historic migration of Jews into the United States and placed restrictions, keeping Jews out when the Nazis rose to power a decade later. The law also radically cut the number of Italians, Greeks, and Eastern Europeans who could enter the country. On signing the act into law, President Coolidge, there he is, in signing the 1924 Immigration Act, he said, "America must remain American," whatever that means. Well, I know what he meant, and I think you do too. But Johnson-Reed did more, much more. It cemented the changes in how America viewed immigration, from a policy of largely open borders to an emphasis on desirables and undesirables. Its Senate sponsor, David Reed of Pennsylvania, wrote in the New York Times, "The law's goal was to make the United States a more homogeneous country," and defended his proposal by saying, "We're not racist, but we want to keep a level of ethnic uniformity in our society. We can't introduce elements too quickly, and this is how we maintain our country's stability." Here's some talking points that you may recognize. This is a quotation. Few of their children in the country learn English. The signs in our streets have inscriptions in both languages. Unless the stream of their importation could be turned, they will soon outnumber us and all the advantages that we have here. We will not be able to preserve our language, and even our government will become precarious. I am not opposed to the immigration of a small number of them, because they have their virtues. But I am worried that the ones who have arrived are generally of the most ignorant, stupid sort of their own nation, and will bring our country down if they continue to immigrate, unquote. So my question to you is, who made those remarks? And who was he talking about? Any idea? Any guess? How about the century? When was it said? 1919. It could have been that those are words akin to words like that that were used then. No, I'll tell you, he was 47 years old when he wrote a letter containing this language to a friend, and, well, it's this man. He was writing about the Germans, by the way. By the way, you would be mistaken if you believe the United States is alone in the history of nativism. For example, Ancient Egyptians depicted foreigners as lesser beings. Ancient Greeks called them barbarians. Romans and ancient Chinese believed they were culturally superior. Indians in India, the Vedic period, produced a caste system. Ancient societies created practice regulating entry, status, and integration of foreigners. More recently, the English deemed the Irish uncivilized. The Völkisch movement in Germany was a precursor to Nazi ideology. There's Italy's fascists, South Africa's apartheid, and Turkey's and India's nationalists. Mexico's xenophobia is directed at Central American immigrants, U.S. expatriates, and indigenous peoples. The bottom line is that cultural purity, protection, and preservation of one's way of life has been a significant goal, unfortunately, in much of human history. For better or worse, it's a trait humanity appears to share. But we're here to focus on U.S. immigration. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, I referred to it briefly just a few moments ago, was the first major U.S. law to limit immigration and provide an absolute 10-year ban on Chinese laborers that was not repealed until 1943. U.S. progressives argued immigrants impeded an ideal society, committed crimes, and abused welfare. This is in the 1880s, by the way. Does that sound familiar? To combat these alleged ills, they backed an activist federal government with eugenics-inspired racial and ethnic statutes to block immigration of Jews, Asians, and Africans. Others argued government had a duty to protect natives from immigrants who were depressing innovation and lowering native-born American wages. By the way, when the word native there is used, they are not talking about indigenous people. They're talking about, well, Western Europeans and their descendants, like this family, which was the winner of the governor's trophy in the eugenics building at the Kansas State Free Fair in 1920 as the fittest family. That's who they were talking about. In 1907, Congress authorized the Dillingham Commission, named for its chair, Senator William Dillingham, to study the origins and effect of recent immigration. Recent immigration being from 1880 to, well, up to that point in 1907. It employed more than 300 people, this commission did, spent more than $1 million in 1907 money, published more than 41 volumes of work, and its conclusion, Eastern and Southern Europeans were not assimilating and were degrading U.S. society and civilization itself. Those views were echoed by Dr. Alfred C. Reed, an assistant surgeon at Ellis Island, who performed medical inspections to screen immigrants for diseases and disabilities. In an article for Popular Science Monthly in January of 1913, he wrote, "America is the land of the alien. But while the principal increase in population has been by immigration, the character of that immigration has been changed markedly in the past 30 years. Previous to 1883, Western and Northern European sent a stalwart stock, 95% of all who came. Scandinavians, Danes, Dutch, Germans, French, Swiss, and English islanders. They were the best of Europe's blood. But for 3 decades, the immigrant tide has flowed more and more from Eastern and Southern Europe. The others still do come, but they are far outnumbered by, you guessed it, Jews, Slavs, the Balkans, and the Austrian races, and from Mediterranean countries. As a class, they contribute little of lasting value. Restriction is vitally necessary if our truly American ideals and institutions are to persist, and our inherited stock of good American manhood is not to be depreciated, unquote. That was not an uncommon feeling at the time. And then in 1915, a group that had been moribund for 43 years rose again in a small Georgia town based on white supremacy. You know what it is? Anyone want to just shout it out? Yes. The KKK sought to prevent immigration of non-white and non-Protestant families to the United States and developed a national reach because xenophobia, racism, and religious hatred was spreading. A popular notion then that America was settled by descendants of a genetically pure Nordic race, biologically superior to other European races, and new immigration was threatening to eradicate it from the American bloodstream. Remember that term. It comes up later. The American bloodstream. Madison Grant's The Passing of the Great Race in 1916 was the best-known work promoting that belief. It urged immigration restrictions based on biology and ethnicity. It served as the major source of inspiration for racial propagandists in the 1920s and molded the views of Congress and the public alike. After World War I, the nation was caught in post-war waves of nationalism, isolationism, anger over hyphenated Americans, and distrust of anything foreign. The Red Scare and immigrants falling prey to communism, anarchism, radicalism, that communist hordes would enter the United States due to the recent Russian Revolution, and more Jews. In particular, more Jews. As a result, Congress was able to narrowly pass the 1917 Immigration Act over President Wilson's veto, as a matter of fact, as restrictionists exploited the climate of xenophobia caused by the war. The State Department made their position clear in a 1920 letter to the chair of the House Committee on Immigration when it said, quote, "The great mass of aliens passing through Rotterdam are Russian Poles or Polish Jews of the usual ghetto type. They are filthy, un-American, and often dangerous in their habits. Every possible care and safeguard should be used to keep out the undesirables." Unquote. So, Senator Dillingham, who you've already met, introduced and Congress enacted the Emergency Quota Act of 1921. I haven't even reached 24 yet. Setting quotas at 3% of the total foreign-born of each nationality of the United States in the 1910 census, with no quotas at all for the Western Hemisphere. A direct attack on immigrants from Central, Southern, and Eastern Europe. Yet activists argued that the American or Nordic type was still in danger of being replaced by undesirable, biologically inferior immigrants.
Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us!
That, of course, was Charlottesville, not in the early 20s, but 2017. The Eugenics Committee of the United States of America, co-founded in 1922 by Madison Grant, yes, the same Madison Grant who wrote The Passing of the Great Race 6 years earlier, created public displays in the 1920s. Here's some of their claims. That committee became the most influential lobby advocating immigration limits in Congress and the chief advisor to Washington State Congressman Albert Johnson, he of Johnson Reed, who was chairman of the House Committee on Immigration and Naturalization. Isn't that convenient? Giving Johnson and his committee the so-called scientific proof it wanted to validate the inferiority of Central, Southern, and Eastern Europeans. By 1924, the quota system was so entrenched, most did not object or even question its continuance, only how to adjust it. There were some advocates for letting more enter, but nativists prevailed. Johnson Reed passed the House 322 to 71, and the Senate with only 6 dissenting votes. Emanuel Manny Seller was a freshman congressman from New York City who opposed Johnson Reed. He later fought isolationists and FDR's administration by his active support to ease immigration on laws regarding for an emergency basis to rescue those fleeing the Holocaust. In 1943, he called FDR's immigration policy cold and cruel. Robert Clancy, a congressman from Detroit, defended the Americanism of Jewish, Italian, and Polish immigrants and attacked the bill as discriminatory and un-American. I'll paraphrase. He said, "Since the foundations of the American Commonwealth, bitter persecution have been aimed at newcomers to our shores. Congressional reports are full of abuse of English, Scotch, and Welsh immigrants as paupers and criminals. Irish and Germans," remember Franklin's quotation, "have been bitterly denounced as mongrels, scum, foreigners, and a menace to our institutions. But today it's the Italians, Spanish, Poles, Jews, Greeks, and Russians who are the racial lepers to be attacked with the fearful fallacy of chosen and inferior peoples, one to rule, the other to be abominated. In this bill, we find racial discrimination at its worst, a blow at Eastern and Southern Europeans, mostly our recent allies in the Great War, Poland and Italy. Jews, too, are aimed at, not directly, because they have no country in Europe to call their own, but they are set down among inferior peoples. Much of the animus against Poland and Russia is directed at the Jew." Well, despite Congressman Clancy's heartfelt words, quotas were cut from 3 to 2% of foreign-born, and the year on which results were based was changed from 1910 to 1890. A blatant effort to limit immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, which mostly arose after 1890. Another change was to the basis of the calculations. The new law traced the origins of the entire populace, including natural-born citizens, with large numbers of people of British descent whose families had lived in the United States a very long time. Each European nation had a quota. But let's take a look at regional totals, and it'll give you a sense of the scheme. Not everyone was upset, though. Not with Johnson Reed. In 1925, while in prison for his violent attempt to overthrow Bavaria, this man, Adolf Hitler, wrote in Mein Kampf, specifically referring to Jews, by the way, "In every mingling of the Aryan with that of lower peoples, the result was the end of the cultured people. All great cultures of the past perished only because the original creative race died out from blood poisoning. Remember that term from before? Blood poisoning? Remember it again, because it will come up once more. He also referred explicitly to Johnson Reed in Mein Kampf when writing, "There is currently," remember, he writes this in 1925. Johnson Reed passed in 1924. Hitler knew what was going on. "There is currently one state in which one can observe at least weak beginnings of a better conception. This is not Germany, but the American Union, which categorically refuses the immigration of physically unhealthy elements and simply excludes the immigration of certain races." Well, as I'm a proud member of one of those races, I thought I'd share with you my own family story. My grandfather, Leib Rishe, changed his name to Louis Rishe, entered the United States on November 15th, 1922 at Ellis Island. Here he is in the United States with my grandmother and their children, including my father Samuel. That's him on my right in the knee-highs. My grandfather, in his Declaration of Intention, dated May 29th, 1923, had to swear to permanently reside in the United States, renounce forever all allegations of fidelity to any foreign state, particularly Poland, which is where they were from at the time. It was on the border, it went back and forth, but at the time he left, it was Poland, and that he was not an anarchist nor a believer in polygamy. And I knew my grandfather. As far as I know, he was not a believer in polygamy. According to the 1930 census, my grandmother, Ruchla, later changed to Rachel, and some of her children, here in a passport photo, entered the United States in 1924. But my grandmother and her children did not qualify to do so. I'm sharing a family secret. Did they legally enter the United States in 1924 as stated in the census? They did not. That might be awkward for me since I later worked for the INS, but they did not enter illegally. The census is wrong. They entered legally 4 years later, and I can demonstrate that. My grandfather waited until he became a citizen on March 7th, 1928. This manifest of alien passengers shows my grandmother and her children were issued visas, there they are, in Warsaw on May 24th, 1928, and then traveled together to Southampton, England, and sailed for the U.S. on August 1st, 1928, reaching New York City on August 7th aboard the SS Olympic. Sister ship, I later found out, to the Britannic and the Titanic. The moral of the story? Assess and verify all research, even from U.S. records. At any event, after the stock market crash in 1929 and the onset of the Great Depression, the Hoover administration wanted to reduce the number of immigrants coming to the United States below the 24 quotas. The State Department was asked to reduce that number without having to go to Congress to alter Johnson Reed. So its advice was this: use, remember I referred to it before and asked you to remember, the 1882 Immigration Act? That's what the State Department said. They did the research, which excluded paupers or persons likely to become a public charge, also known as an LPC, since it seemed to fit Depression-era conditions and could be read to deny visas based on, well, frankly, just about anything. Critically, no law required the LPC clause to continue past Hoover's presidency, which ended in March of 1933, 2 months into Hitler's rule. The American Jewish Congress and the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society urged FDR the very month of his inauguration to allow the German quota to be filled. Instead, FDR left Hoover's version in place, in effect telling consular officials to deny visas to anyone who could not prove they probably would not become a public charge. How could refugees prove that negative? And how would officers decide? How's this for a catch-22? Under a provision in the 1917 Act, the applicant could not have a job arranged for him or her on arrival in the United States unless he, or most likely she, was a domestic. On one hand, applicants had to prove they were not likely to become a public burden to the society, and on the other, if they admitted they had work waiting for them, they were rejected. Yeah, I agree. So consular officials tended to require applicants to show proof of assets they would be able to transfer to the United States. But what assets and in what amounts? Each officer was permitted to decide for themselves, leaving untold numbers of refugees outside the United States. In the Nazi era, the U.S. could have kept within the overall country-by-country quotas of the onerous 1924 Immigration Act and still have admitted 350,000 more refugees from Germany and German-occupied or allied countries. Why didn't the United States admit enough refugees to satisfy even the paltry quotas? Only once during the 12 years of Nazi rule was the German quota filled. In 1939, when the combined German and Austrian annual quotas were all of 27,370. Why? For every other year, German immigrants were below the numbers allowed, leaving nearly 2/3 of each year's quotas unfilled. Why? The total number of visas issued for all countries in that period was 378,000, well below the 2 million allowed. Why? Though 1920 immigration laws echoed fears about too many Jews entering the country, they were not designed to block Jews escaping Nazi Germany. That was not anticipated, nor intended as a result, but it was the consequence. How? Inflexible quotas of the 1924 Immigration Act are often blamed for failure of more European Jews finding refuge in the United States. Johnson Reed was clearly regrettable, but it was the State Department that decided to implement an anti-foreign, anti-Semitic policy that went far beyond what Congress had prescribed. Visa applications required, various records. 2 copies of a passport, and prison and military records, 2 certified copies of a birth certificate, and copies of all other available public records kept by the government to which allegiance was owed. Now, you might find it reasonable that obtaining records from the Nazis would be problematic for Jews, but not the State Department. Arthur Morris, in his While 6 Million Died, A Chronicle of American Apathy, said, "The notion of a Jew dropping by police headquarters to receive a certificate of good character from his oppressors may strike you as strange, but State Department files refer repeatedly to this requirement and its importance." He credits this interpretation to one man, this man, Green Hackworth, the State Department's legal advisor, who said, It is believed the mere fact that a Jew has been driven out of Germany into another country or has found it desirable to flee from Germany to escape persecution does not, in and of itself, excuse him from producing the documents if it is reasonably possible for him to obtain such documents upon applying to the appropriate German authorities. By the way, if you're curious about Mr. Hackworth's robes, he was later appointed by the United Nations for his legal acumen and made a judge at the International Courts of Justice for 15 years at The Hague. In any event, under pressure from Jewish and other groups, the State Department agreed its counsels could waive requirements for documents that could only be acquired through various risks of inconvenience, personal injury, financial loss, or the peculiar delay of embarrassment that might attend the request of a political or religious refugee to his former government. It's quite a mouthful, but that's what it said. Sounds reasonable? Sadly not in practice. Batami Zucker, professor of American history at Bar-Ilan University, studied the issue, and she stated in 2001, "I have not located a single case, not a single case, where the applicant was informed of such an option." On the contrary, the councils insisted on submission of the full list of documents, so said Batami Zucker. A most notable exception is that of Hiram Bingham IV, whose story as a vice consul in Marseille is remarkable under these circumstances for his integrity. Now, I don't have time for his story now, but if someone asks me about him later in the Q&A, I can talk about it. That's a teaser. Councils could also be very selective about documents that were produced. They often rejected records if a certificate reflected a marriage performed under Jewish but not civil law, if they did not like the notary, or a police record didn't include the last 5 years. What good was that? That was a time when Jews were being indiscriminately arrested for anything. During the 30s, most notable European Jews fled Nazi Germany, as a result of anti-Semitism, and found work in the United States, typically in academia, including, for example, Hannah Arendt, Albert Einstein, Abraham Joshua Heschel, Erich Korngold, Herbert Marcuse, and Arnold Schoenberg. How were they permitted U.S. entry? Well, there were provisions in the 24 Act with no limit granting non-quota visitors to ministers and professors and their wives and unmarried children under 18. The provision stated that the immigrant must have been teaching continuously for 2 years, immediately preceding the application for admission to the United States. But most Jews couldn't qualify, since the Nazis had fired them in 1933 for being Jews. The 2-year limit was dropped in 1940, but a U.S. job for 2 years still had to be assured. Councils also decided which schools were proper teaching institutions, routinely deciding that a professor had to have been a classroom teacher, thus barring researchers and librarians. Many were denied who were professors in Europe, based on a consul's decision that the scholar, scholar was too old now, or too foreign to be a good classroom teacher. The State Department also slowed the process just when speed was of the essence, when the Nazis began deporting Jews to their deaths in Poland. For example, in 1942, January, Slavic scholar Michel Gorlin was denied a non-quota visa. He was in a French internment camp and had a 2-year appointment waiting for him at the New School for Social Research in New York City. But the State Department decided he had, and this is a quote, "little or nothing to add to the war effort." The new school and Gorland's sister, who was in the United States, pushed his appeal. In September, the State Department granted Gorland, finally, a non-quota visa, but he had already been deported to Auschwitz and murdered there. He was 33 years old. But that's not the end of that story. After her husband's deportation, Rishe Gorland, a poet and medieval historian, left her 6-year-old daughter Dora with a friend and fled Paris for central France. She worked as a teacher under an assumed ID and joined the resistance. Her daughter joined her later. 2 days after that, Dora became ill and died. Hazak tried crossing the border into Switzerland, was arrested, sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau, and immediately sent to the gas chamber. I'm sorry, that story always gets to me. If only the State Department had decided that Michelle Gorland was worth saving a little earlier. If only. Another example. May 31st, 1938, Georg Hindels was arrested shortly before his final exams in dentistry and later deported to Dachau. And then he was moved to Buchenwald. Fortunately, he had already applied for a visa in 1932, which was granted while he was in custody. Picture this now. Put yourself in his mother's place. She took his visa to Vienna, to the office of the Gestapo, and convinced them to release him from Buchenwald. Can you imagine? She then arranged for his emigration to the United States, and from there, Hindels arranged for his parents' emigration, where they live for the rest of their lives. There's another group of scholars and those who did so much for them for you to consider. It's a wonderful story of how the African American community opened its doors to Jewish refugees when practically no one else would. Many otherwise trapped Jewish academics found their way to historically black colleges and universities in the United States, such as Howard University and Hampton Institute. For colleges, hiring the scholars promised an opportunity to expose their students to new ideas from abroad. What a concept. For the scholars, it was a place to find a home when no one else offered one. The circumstances were unique. 2 minority groups with firsthand knowledge of persecution. Many of the professors had never even met a black person before, but often felt a quick kinship with their students. Georg Iggers, a German Jew who taught history at Philander Smith, said, "Racial segregation reminded me a lot of Nazi Germany, except I wasn't the victim. The black population was." Many of the students forged bonds with their Jewish professors, fostering deep, intellectual, and poignant relationships that lasted a lifetime. For example, Austrian art professor Victor Lohenfeld and African-American muralist John Biggers. Biggers intended to become a plumber. But when he took a drawing class in 1941 at Hampton Institute with Lohenfeld, his life changed. He became a renowned artist and later founded and chaired the art department at Texas State, now Texas Southern University. Many refugee students rose to notable positions. Dr. Joyce Ladner, a graduate of Tougaloo, became the first female president of Howard University. And Dr. Joycelyn Elders of Philander Smith became Surgeon General of the United States. Like Ladner, many, to one degree or another, credited their success to the profound impact. Those are not my words. Those are words that are repeated over and over by these graduates of their professors. Through the 1930s, the State Department used all its means to admit as few refugees as possible. It did so under the guise of economic concerns, of course, at the time of high unemployment, and used the Depression to find rationales for rejections. Restrictive U.S. immigration policies were not lifted during the Holocaust, news of which began reaching the U.S. in 1941 and 1942. We cannot know for certain, but the Zeckelman Holocaust Center in Michigan estimates that 190 to 200,000 more Jews could have been saved during World War II. Why didn't that happen? Barriers were purposefully created to keep Jews out of the United States, frankly, by one man, Breckinridge Long, Assistant Secretary in charge of the State Department's Visa Division. By the way, in October of 1943, just 3 days before Yom Kippur, 400 Orthodox rabbis, most of whom would be today characterized as Haredi, marched to the White House to plead with FDR to rescue European Jews. This is another teaser because I don't have time. If someone wants to ask me about the March of the Rabbis in 1943, please do. I can expand on it at that point. At Senate hearings on a resolution asking FDR to create an agency to provide refuge for Jews left under Nazi rule, Long tried to stop intelligence about mass murder from reaching the United States because he feared release of that news might result in pressure on the State Department. In November of 1943, the House Committee on Foreign Affairs held hearings on a bipartisan resolution calling on President Roosevelt to appoint a commission to create and implement plans to rescue European Jews. Long testified in closed session that the U.S. had accepted 580,000 since 1933. He lied. The claim was proven false. Secretary Treasury Henry Morgenthau Jr. had received a staff report which was entitled, "Report to the Secretary on the Acquiescence of this Government in the Murder of Jews." Morgenthau softened the title when he sent it to the President to personal report to the President. But it did expose the State Department's efforts to make Jewish entry into the United States nearly hopeless. Here's Morgenthau's and his department's conclusion. They have not only failed to use government machinery at their disposal to rescue Jews from Hitler, but have even gone so far as to use government machinery to prevent rescue of Jews. They have not only failed to cooperate with private organizations to work out individual programs, but have taken steps designed to prevent these programs from being put into effect. FDR finally responded by creating the War Refugee Board in January of 1944. With the now certain Allied victory, it aided hundreds of thousands in World War II's final 17 months. Long was finally reassigned, and in November of 1944, he finally resigned from the State Department. Am I going to run over, or have I already? I can. All right, I'm going to skip a bit, go to my conclusion. There is displaced persons. I'm just going to read. I have a few quotes that, especially one from Eleanor Roosevelt, but we can talk about that later. Let me see. These were all significant people. There's Long again. Harrison is significant. DPs. There's, Manny. You remember that man from 1924? He was a freshman congressman then, Emanuel Manny Siller. In 1965, the 24 Act lasted 41 years. He was still in Congress, and he was still fighting for Johnson Reed's repeal. And this time he succeeded what later became known as Hart-Celler, a new law based on reuniting families and attracting skilled labor to the United States. As you've heard, Johnson Reed was based on progressive activist claims that the American or Nordic type was in danger of being replaced by unwanted, biologically inferior immigrants. But witness, that kind of language is not dead. Witness, in 2018, the current president asked why the U.S. would accept more immigrants from Haiti and shithole countries in Africa instead of Norway. Do Norwegians even want to come? I don't know. Witness, in April of 2024, he said, they're not humans, they're animals. And the very title of Executive Order 14159, executed in January of this year, uses similar language, protecting the American people against invasion. And one more is especially revealing, certainly to me. Referring to immigrants in New Hampshire in December of 2023, he said, remember poisoning the blood? He said, they're poisoning the blood. Oh, excuse me. There's Harrison. I'm not far enough. That's the, I'm just going to close this. He said, they're poisoning the blood of our country. They poison mental institutions and prisons all over the world, not just in South America, not just in 3 or 4 countries, but all over the world. Focus on that concept, poisoning the blood of our country. To restate Sinclair Lewis's 1935 novel's title, It Can't Happen Here. If you haven't read it, I urge you to. The effort to demonize undesirables can and has happened here. When Earl Harrison resigned as U.S. Commissioner for Immigration and Naturalization in 1944 to become Dean of the University of Pennsylvania Law School, a career move taking him from government service back to academia. He said that the only country outside the United States that observed racial discrimination relating to naturalization was Nazi Germany. And we all agree this is not very desirable company. Unfortunately, Earl Harrison appears to have been mistaken. Others apparently do currently disagree. Thank you for your attention.
Jerry, you're a wealth of information. Does anybody have a question?
Comment?
All right, the suggestion is that Jerry returns all year round. Does anybody else have a comment or, okay?
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much. You are a wealth of information. I learned so much from your presentation. I have a personal question. I'll preface it by telling you about my own sense about this. It's so complicated. First of all, it seems like the targets right now, and they do vary from time to time based on your reporting, are the Hispanics. They seem to be the target. Maybe I'm mistaken, but that's the impression I get from what you see in the news and whatnot. I decided I wanted to take a look and see economically who was contributing to the gross domestic product on a different topic. And that was everybody was complaining that all the states were running out of money. And I wanted to find out who's putting the money in the coffers. Well, I will tell you, and I may have told some friends of mine in this group already, the Hispanics contribute trillions of dollars every year to the economy. Now, the report that I saw was by going online to look at gross domestic product. They didn't delineate between citizens and not citizens. That is a very, very important thing to know. But the second thing is that I have a niece who probably it's been about 10 years or so, who was raped by a Mexican gentleman who came across the border illegally. She was raped. It took years to find him. She'll never be the